So continuing with some factoring, we're going to take a look at factoring trinomials. And in order to really factor trinomials, we need to understand that they are the product of two binomials to begin with. So main keys of factoring trinomials are the ability to quickly and accurately multiply the binomials. So we've sometimes called that FOIL. And then the ability to work with signed numbers. So making sure that you know your positives, negatives, and what happens when you multiply those. We're going to try a couple of these here. And we're going to write the product in simplest ax squared plus bx plus c, a trinomial form. Okay, so this is kind of our warming up to being able to factor. This is actually going opposite of factoring. So starting with this one, we need to remember that FOIL method or that double distribution. FOIL meaning first terms, and then you multiply the two outside terms, then you multiply the two inners, and the two lasts. Okay, so 5x times x, we get 5x squared. Two outside terms, 5x times negative 2 is a negative 10x. Your 2. Okay, now we're going to go multiply the inside, so we should have negative 4 times x, so that's a negative 4x. And then we multiply the last, so we hear a negative 4 times a negative 2, so that's a positive 8. So now we just want to think combine like terms, so we're going to combine those two terms. So negative 10x and a negative 4x, we get a negative 14x plus 8. So now we've taken those two terms, distributed them, and we have our trinomial. Okay, we'll try another one. Same idea. So we start with our first term. So 4x times 3x, we get 12x squared. Go to your outside term. So that's a negative 32x. Go to your inside term. So 3 times 3x, that's a positive 9x. Now our last term's positive 3 times a negative 8 is a negative 24. And then again, you want to combine like terms. So we're going to combine our x terms. So our trinomial now, we have 12x squared. When I combine a negative 32 and a positive 9, I get a negative 23x, and then minus 24. So here is our final trinomial. Okay, it says consider this trinomial. So now we have 6x squared minus 35x minus 6. And below are 4 guesses of how this trinomial factors. So 2 of these guesses are unintelligent, meaning that they should not ever be checked. And we're going to cross those out. Okay, so the 2 that are unintelligent. Well, if I look at this second one right here, unintelligent, and the reason is because if I took my first 2 terms, x times x, I would get x squared. I don't get that 6. I'm missing the 6. I don't want that one. Okay, another unintelligent guess, if we were to look at this, would maybe be our last one. Okay, and the reason I would say your last one is because if I try a negative 2 and I multiply that negative 2 by a negative 3, taking my last terms, I would get a positive 6, and I see over here I need a negative 6. So again, unintelligent, we're not going to take them. So the 2 that remain, we're going to check both and determine which is the correct factorization. Okay, so if I start with this first one here, 3x times 2x, I get 6x squared. My outside terms would give me a negative 9x. My inside terms would give me a positive 4x. And my last terms would give me a negative 6. And again, if we combine our like terms here, I'm going to have a negative 5x minus 6. So not going to be our answer because I need a negative 35. So hopefully this last one works here. So 6x times x, we get 6x squared. Our outside, I'd get a negative 36. On the inside, I'd have a positive x. Ooh, I forgot the x there, sorry. And then on my last one, I would have a negative 6. So again, if we combine those like terms, I now have a negative 35x minus 6. So that would be our winner. This is going to be our answer. Right. And the easiest of all trinomial factoring is going to occur when the leading coefficient is 1. Our leading coefficient is that a term, the term in front of the x squared. So we're going to factor each of these following trinomials. So when we factor we're doing basically the reverse of what we just did. We need two factors. And when I'm looking at this last term, think about how we came up with it. I need two numbers that are going to multiply to be that last term, and then they had to add to be our middle term. So I know, because my first term here is x squared, x times x, if I think of how we get that first term, it's the first two numbers multiplied together, the f and the FOIL, gets me x squared. Okay? I needed two numbers that multiply together to be my last term, negative 35. So if I think of factors of negative 35, you could do, 1 and 35. You could do 5, and you could do 7. And I'm going to stop with 5 and 7 because I can see that that's going to somehow add to be 2. Now, here's a little trick. The sign of your middle term, so the middle term is positive, always goes with your larger number. So that means now I would ask myself, a positive 7 times a what type of 5 would get me a negative 35, and that's a negative 5. Now, if I add these two, negative 5 and a positive 7, that in fact adds to get me a positive 2. So those are my factors, and you're done with that one. Okay, so we'll try this again over here. So I have to find something that's going to multiply to be positive 22, and it's going to add to be a negative 13. Okay, and again, I have a leading coefficient of 1. That's why these are going to be a little bit easier to factor. And I know my first term is x and x. So if I'm thinking of numbers that are going to multiply to be 22, well, I could do 2 and 11. Other factors in there, I could do 1 and 22. But 2 and 11 is going to be the one that we want. Now again, if it has to multiply to be 22, I want to think sign of my middle term is negative. So that means my larger term is negative. Okay, so a negative times a what gets you a positive? A negative times a negative gets you a positive. And if I think negative 2 plus a negative 11, that's going to add to get me the negative 13. So those are our two factors. Okay. And so last thing that we have here, again, it has to multiply to be 50, and that's a negative 50. It has to add to be a negative 5. Because it's a coefficient of 1, I know each of my terms are x. Now if I need something that's going to multiply to be negative 50, all right, well, I could think of that as 5 and 10. The sign of the middle term is negative, so my larger factor is negative. A negative 5 times a, negative 10 times a positive 5 gets you a negative 50. If I add these two numbers, they give me a negative 5. So those are going to be my two factors. I have a positive 5 and I have a negative 10. So something maybe you just want to jot down so that you remember this. When we're doing this middle term, multiply to b, add to b. Multiply to b, these are the two last. Okay, so we had said two last numbers, right? So negative 5 times 7 gave me the 35. Has to add to be the middle term. Okay, so multiply to be the last term, add to be the middle term. Might just be a little way to kind of help you keep this factoring under control. Okay, so let's try a few more. So we're going to factor each of the following trinomials that have prime leading coefficients not equal to 1. Okay, so if you watch Kirk's video, he's going to take you through a guess and check method. I'm going to try you on a different method to begin with right away. Something that's a little bit, in my opinion, easier, less guessing and checking, and it's more of a process. Okay, notice that what we're saying here, prime coefficient, not 1. So I have something right here that's not 1, different from what we started with. So when we're doing this time this whole multiply and add thing still works. It's just when we do the multiply, I have to take the first times the last. Okay, so multiply first times last. And it's still going to add to be the middle term. Okay, so if I multiply the first times the last, that's telling me it has to be something that's going to multiply to be 120. And it has to add to be something that's 19. Okay, So factors that are going to multiply to be 120. And if you don't know these, that's okay. Make a whole list. So you could make a list, and you could even start with 1 and 120. And you could go 2 and 60. And maybe you do 3 and 40. Maybe you make all your factors until you find something that works. So maybe 5 and 24. Okay, so if I'm looking at 5 and 24, the whole plus minus sign still works. Sign of the middle term, which is positive, goes to your larger factor. And then I have to think a positive 24 times a what type of 5 would give me negative, so there's a negative. And if I add these two numbers up, these will add to be 19. Okay, so how do we do this? You copy the first term. You copy the last term. We're going to fill in the blanks with the two numbers that we found here. So I found a negative 5x, and I found a positive 24x. The next step, we want to think factor by grouping. So I'm going to group these, and I'm going to group these. And really, it doesn't matter how you put the 5 and the 24. Either way will still work. Okay. So our next step here is to think, what can I factor out of this term? Well, really, the only thing I could factor out of this would be a 1. So I'm left with 3x minus 5. I'm sorry, not a 1. It should be a 1x. So I'm going to factor out that x. X times 3x gets me that 3x squared. X times negative 5 gets me a negative 5x. Okay. Going to this next one, what can I factor out from 24 and 40? And I want to think, I want the largest number possible. So I could take an 8. Okay, so 8 times what would give me 24x? So how about 8 times 3x? 8 times what would give me a negative 40? And that would be 8 times negative 5. Okay, so keep in mind what we just did, and I should write this as a positive 8 just so we keep that in mind. Think about what we have here. I have this repeated factor and a repeated factor here. Okay, so what we do is I want that repeated factor. If you find that repeated factor, you know that you've done it correctly. You get two factors out of this. One, the repeated factor. And then two, we make a factor with whatever's left over. So what I have left over is x plus 8, and you have now factored this completely. So here is your final answer. Okay, we're going to try it again. So over here, I have to find two numbers that are going to multiply. Start by doing first times last. It has to multiply to be a positive 36. It has to add to your middle term of negative 15. Okay. And again, go through, you can make your factors. You could say 6 and 6. You could say 12 and 3. Sign of the middle term goes with your larger factor. So my larger factor is a negative. I have to think a negative times a what would give me a positive 36. So a negative times a positive. And if I were to add those, I would not get negative 15. That's because I have a mistake. It should actually be a negative. I apologize. Negative times a negative would get you a positive. A negative 12 plus a negative 3 would get you a negative 15. Okay, so we found our factors. So let's do the same thing that we did before. Copy your first term. Copy your last term. And then we're going to fill in the blanks with the factors that we found. So I have a negative 12x, and I have a negative 3x. Okay, and again, the first step, factor by grouping. Okay, so out of my first term here, I can pull out both a 2 and an x. Okay, so 2x times x gets me 2x squared. 2x times a negative 6 would get me negative 12x. Over here, again, what can I pull out? I can pull out something in common in both of these is a negative 3. And keep in mind, your goal is to get the same factor over here. So a negative 3 times a x would give me a negative 3x. A negative 3 times a negative 6 would give me a positive 18. Okay, so now again, I have that repeated factor, so that's my one term. And then my other factor turns out to be the stuff that I have on the outside. So 2x minus 3. We're going to try a couple more. So same idea, we're going to factor these trinomials. We're going to start with this first one. So it's something that has to multiply to be positive 30, and it has to add to be our middle term of 13. Okay, so factors that are going to work here, how about 10 and 3 would multiply to be 30. And since everything's positive, I know that these are all going to be positive, which again would add to give me 13. Okay, so copy the first term, copy your last term, fill in the blanks with your two terms. So plus 10x plus 3x, and then factor by grouping. So group them, we're going to group them. Okay. We're going to pull out things that are in common. Things in common on both of these factors, we're going to have 5x. Okay, so 5x times x gets me 15x squared. I'm sorry, I need a 3 in there too. 5x times 3x gets you 15x squared. 5x times 2, and that's a positive 2, would get you 10x. Over here, I'm thinking, what can I pull out that's in common in both of these? And really nothing, but that's okay, because look what I have here. That's that same factor. So the only thing I could factor out, which you can, is a positive 1. So positive 1 times 3x gets you 3x. Positive 1 times 2 gets you 2. Okay, so now we have that repeated factor. And then the other factor comes from the stuff on the outside. So I have a 5x plus 1. And you have factored that completely. We're going to try this next one over here. So same idea. Has to multiply to be, get a big number here, negative 300. And it has to add to be a positive 13. And this may take a little bit of work. I'm going to try and help you out here and tell you, how about 25 and 12? Okay, it has to add, multiply to be these two numbers. The sign of the middle term is positive, goes with my larger factor. So 25 has to be a positive. So a positive times a what gets you a negative? How about a positive times a negative? When I add, just a quick double check, that does give me 13. Okay, so we start again. Copy the first term. Copy your last term. We're going to fill in the space with the two factors that we found. Just don't forget, attach that x. And then we're going to factor by grouping. So group your first two terms, group your second two terms. And think to yourself, what's in common with both of these terms? I can pull out both a 5 and an x. So 5x times 2x would give me 10x squared. 5x times 5 would give me 25. Go to our next term. Common in both of these, I see both a negative and I would see a 6 in common. Okay, so negative 6 times 2x would give me negative 12x. Negative 6 times positive 5 would give me 30. And again, we want that repeated factor of which we found. So that's good. That means you factor this correctly and completely. And so now, one factor is that repeated factor. And what's left over is 5x minus 6. That would make your second term. Okay. So we have two more. I'm going to leave you with answers. My hope is you'll try this on your own and see, did I factor this completely? So here would be your answer for part C, and here would be your answer for part D. Okay. This is definitely tough stuff. We're going to practice this in class. Please bring any questions that you have to class, and we will go through this. Okay, hope you guys have a great day.